All right, everybody, welcome back to Contemporary American Literature. This will be the final series of lectures. I think I'll do 2 lectures on each of the 2 writers we're going to read in this final week as we come right down to the present. The final thing we're going to read is from last year and reflects the pandemic. The story Systems, or whatever it is, Systems by Charles Yu. And other things we read will span a broader length of time, but will still, I think, reflect some of the most salient issues in contemporary American literature from the last 10 to 15 years or so. Part of our discussion this week will be to continue this idea of the new sincerity. I think in particular Jennifer Egan, and in certain ways Charles Yu as well, reflect new, sincere ideals. But I also think there's a move coming out of the new sincerity in the last decade or so that I am calling here the new authenticity. And sincerity implies that what I'm telling you is true and real. But authenticity is a further claim, which is that I, in my own sort of identity, am authentic, and thus what I tell you is true. So anyone could tell you something true, but authenticity implies that what they're telling you is true to their own identity and true to their own experience. And I think some of the focus on history and on the body that we're going to see in some of these works and on sort of mental experiences goes with this idea of authenticity that I think has a lot to do with some of the things we've talked about earlier in the course, such as identity politics and, rooting literature in identity. And I think when you look at some of the trends of the last 10 years in particular, such as something we'll discuss called auto-fiction, you can see this focus on the self. My image source is just, it's just an image I borrowed from a discussion of auto-fiction, and it shows this kind of overlapping Venn diagram of the author, the self, and the other. And I don't even actually know what that means, because who is the reader? Is this the author, the author's self, and then the other? The self of the reader, the self of the other to the reader, and the other to the author? I don't particularly understand the image, but I thought it was interesting, and I thought, you need an illustration for the slide. So that's my illustration. But the idea behind this illustration, whoever these figures are meant to represent, is this connection, this use of literature to make connections and to connect author and reader, self and other, which I think is something that applies whether you're talking about the new sincerity, which is an official term that I didn't make up, and the new authenticity, which is more my own term that I did make up and want to apply to some of this literature. So we're reading a variety of genres, fiction, poetry, and then some of the... So Jennifer Egan's story is clearly a work of fiction. Natasha Trethewey is clearly writing poetry. I think when we get to Lydia Davis and Charles Yu, we're getting into something that I also think, and I've probably mentioned this in previous weeks, is a key of really contemporary American literature, like the last 10 to 15 years, which is hybridity of genres, which we've seen before. We saw that with elements of the new journalism, blending fiction and nonfiction, with writers like Gloria Anzaldúa and Ishmael Reed blending poetry and memoir and manifesto. And I think we see it. It's almost, I think, become a defining feature of the literature of the last 10 years or so, this idea that you write something and you could understand it as fiction, as nonfiction, as prose poetry, as theory, as memoir. And I think we see that clearly in the work of Lydia Davis and Charles Yu. So like I said, I'm going to try to give two lectures this week. One will consider Natasha Trethewey and Jennifer Egan together, and one will consider Lydia Davis and Charles Yu together. And then that will be the end of our semester, because that will bring us right up to the present. So with that said, let's start with the final poet we're going to read in this course, Natasha Trethewey. So she was born in Gulfport, Mississippi in 1966 to an interracial couple who had married a year before the U.S. Supreme Court legalized mixed-race marriages, but she was raised in the South. And then a very tragic aspect of her childhood and adolescence is that her mother was murdered in 1985 by her second ex-husband, Trethewey's stepfather, when Trethewey was only 19. So she has this trauma in her past, as well as this, when you consider the marriage of her parents, this connection to American history. And that's also informed by this personal trauma. And I think this accounts for some of what you read by her. I assigned the poem Native Guard, which is kind of a long poem of about 5 pages. But also if you looked at some of the other poetry that was in the Norton Anthology, you see that reflection on personal trauma, also using African-American traditions such as the blues tradition to comment on it. She was educated at the University of Georgia and the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and served as U.S. Poet Laureate in 2012 and 2013, and is known for poetry that explores history and race in America. And I quoted, so the biography section this week will be very short because we're dealing with living authors, often rather young authors who haven't had big biographies written about them, so I don't necessarily have a lot to say about their lives, so I'll mostly keep that short. I did excerpt a passage from the Norton Anthology's bio, as I usually do, which is just the conclusion they come to about Trethewey's work. Readers will find her poetry accessible, humane, and democratic, which is not something we've always seen in the poetry in this course. We've seen it sometimes, this idea that poetry should be accessible, humane, and democratic. I think we saw that in Lucille Clifton most particularly, and maybe we could see Trethewey as in some ways continuing Clifton's work. And in a way, we could maybe see Frank O'Hara. I don't know how accessible Frank O'Hara was, but I think he was democratic and humane. Adrienne Rich was definitely trying to be democratic and humane. I don't know how accessible her poetry was. And that's been kind of a debate, I think, not an official debate that they were knowingly conducting with each other, but it's kind of a debate we've seen among the poets in this course over how accessible poetry should be in the modern world. Should it go out onto the street and speak to the people as... which could be, that could look like any number of things. It could look like what Frank O'Hara does, and it can look like what Natasha Trethewey does, which are very different things, and they're accessible, humane, and democratic in different ways. Or should it be a little bit more what they call hermetic, that is, like as of a hermit, sort of sealed off in itself, as the guardian of certain values that would corrode if they became more public. And I think that's something that we've seen in Elizabeth Bishop or John Ashbery, or in certain ways in Louise Glick, whose poetry is accessible in its way, but is maybe even humane. I don't know if it's democratic. I'm just interested in this list of terms. I think I've told you I like lists, and I think it's interesting to rank all the poets we've read as how they score on the humane, accessible, humane, and democratic index. So, but that's just a digression. So, but it is not therefore safe or easy. So, so you note they gave you that list, and then they worried that list made poetry sound a little too much like something you would find in a get well card or something, or inspirational quotes in a day planner. So they want to revoke that a little and say, but humane, accessible, and democratic doesn't mean safe or easy. That literature should still retain this quality to be provocative, to confront one with uncomfortable truths, etc. Trethewey shows how our practice of art and our conception of beauty have been complicit with racist violence. She also shows us how the human body and voice are unmade and perhaps ultimately remade under the weight of history. And I'm very interested in this idea of the body. I think this is what Trethewey and Egan have nothing in particular to do with one another, aside from the fact that they're of the same generation. They're writing in different genres about different things, but I think this interest in the body is something they share with each other, and they share with other writers of this generation, and this emphasis on the body and how it's shaped by history and how it can shape the future is, I think, a key element of the literature of this particular period, the last 10 to 20 years. And I think we see that in Native Guard, which is a historical poem. It's a sequence of sort of, this is an interesting window into Trethewey's accessibility. It's a sequence of sonnets, more or less. They're poems of 14 lines, but they don't really hew to the traditional form of the sonnet. So they're not rhymed. They're not really in regular meter. They're different traditional forms of the sonnet going back to the Middle Ages. There's the Petrarchan sonnet from the Italian sonnet, and then there's the Shakespearean sonnet. Shakespeare adopts the sonnet form and is perhaps the most famous practitioner of the sonnet in English. But then the sonnet has a key role in the African-American literary tradition, particularly in the works of Claude McKay. And so it goes back to the Harlem Renaissance and the African-American tradition as a key form. So Trethewey is drawing on this traditional form that has European and American and within American, African-American antecedents, but she's also doing it in a kind of free verse way to make it, I think, less forbidding with its, meter and rhyme than it might otherwise be. So she does these kinds of free verse sonnets, and she does this poem, Native Guard, that is a sequence of sonnets that reflects the experience of a group of African-American soldiers during the Civil War who had been enslaved and were then freed from slavery, became soldiers, and served as guards in the South. It was in Louisiana, of Confederate soldiers. And so it's a series of reflections and I think the implication is that we have a number of speakers here representing the collective experience of the Native Guard and what they experienced while they were guarding these Confederate soldiers. And the sequence begins with an epigraph, which is a quote introducing a literary work from Frederick Douglass, the famous abolitionist who wrote perhaps the most famous slave narrative in American literature, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And it's a quote from Douglass about the Civil War. He says, "If this war is to be forgotten, I ask in the name of all things sacred, what shall men remember?" So this poem sets as its goal this act of memory, this act of recovery, because it's not enough for something, history is just what happened in the past. History from this point of view is sort of inert. It could lay in a book. It could just rest in a book and nobody could know about it. To know history is in some sense to remember what happened. And so this poem sets itself the goal of historical recovery. And already we see something that's not very postmodern. I think postmodernism would regard history as in many ways inaccessible and merely the construct of whoever is looking back. It's not something that we have access to. It's something that can be reconstructed in language, but that reconstruction will just be a further simulacrum, not something that necessarily has inherent legitimacy or authority. This poem clearly seems, on the other hand, to want to recover the historical as truth, as something we don't want to forget because it happened and was true. And to experience history as memory, we have to sort of hear it in the voices of those it happened to. And what happens in this poetic sequence is that it is the voices of speakers who conflate language and the body, who conflate language and the experience of what has happened to their bodies. And so this becomes not just sincere, the act of telling the truth, but authentic, the telling of the truth of identity as identity is rooted in the experience of the body. And my third image on my slide is an article that appeared I think in, I want to say 2012, in the Atlantic magazine by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And Ta-Nehisi Coates is one of the most important writers of nonfiction of the last 10 years. Excuse me, an African-American author reflecting both on his personal experience in works like his famous memoir, Between the World and Me, but also the broader history of African Americans. And he writes this article in 2012 called Why Do So Few Blacks Study the Civil War? And it's about how African Americans should recover the Civil War as a key part of their history. It shouldn't just be left to largely white Civil War reenactors, which I think is a kind of stereotype, some kind of a nostalgia for the 19th century on the part of white Americans was, I think, the stereotype of people who were sort of hobbyists of the Civil War. And Coates says, no, African Americans should be interested in the Civil War as the recovery of their history and the moment where they exercised agency toward their own freedom, as showcased in this poem, Native Guard, by the emphasis on Union soldiers who were themselves African American, that freedom was not a gift bestowed by Abraham Lincoln on African Americans, but something that they fought for and secured themselves. And then the other reason I invoke Ta-Nehisi Coates to think about this poem, and I do think Ta-Nehisi Coates will probably, I would be surprised if he didn't appear in the next edition of the anthology, is that he puts into circulation popularly something it's a term he borrows from more academic discourse, but he puts into circulation this idea of what he calls the black body, that African Americans are often reduced to bodies by white culture, bodies that are acted upon and inscribed by the violence of white culture. The destruction of the black body is something he emphasizes in his memoir, Between the World and Me. And this has been a controversial formulation, by the way, within the African American literary community, with some people saying that the phrase and the way in which it became sort of trendy after Coates is kind of reproduces the very dehumanization that it ostensibly means to critically emphasize, that it reduces black people to bodies, even though the idea that is to protest this reduction. But nevertheless, this idea of the body, and the body as the repository of history, the body as the source of language, the body as the source of knowledge, of memory, of authority, I think fits in with this idea of new authenticity coming out of the identity politics that we were talking about earlier in the course. And we see this, I think, this is a long poem, Native Guard, so I just want to take a few excerpts from it to look at passages that I think emphasize these ideas. So, each sonnet is titled with a month and a year that reflects the experience of this company of soldiers. So I want to read the first one, and then on the next slide I want to look at excerpts from a couple more. All right, this is the first one, right after the epigraph. November 1862. Truth be told, I do not want to forget anything of my former life. The landscape's song of bondage, dirge in the river's throat where it churns into the gulf, wind in trees choked with vines. I thought to carry with me want of freedom, though I had been freed. Remembrance, not constant recollection. Yes, I was born a slave at harvest time in the parish of Ascension. I've reached 33 with history of one younger inscribed upon my back. I now use ink to keep record, a closed book, not the lure of memory, flawed, changeful, that dulls the lash for the master, sharpens it for the slave. So a couple things to point out about this poem. We have the emphasis on memory that was introduced with Douglas's epigraph, and this idea that I think very much resonates with Coates's piece on studying the Civil War, of the importance of remembering even painful history. I do not want to forget anything of my former life. And why doesn't he want to forget? Why doesn't this speaker want to forget? Well, it's implied that, first of all, the landscape's song of bondage, the kind of cultural, creative expression that was forged in the hardships of slavery. There was something that August Wilson also alluded to in Fences often, as well as this line, I thought to carry with me want of freedom, though I had been freed. And want is a word that can mean two things. In its more archaic meaning, the meaning it would have held in the 19th century, it meant lack. a want of freedom is a lack of freedom. But then in our more modern language, it means desire, a desire for freedom. And so Trethewey is playing on this possibility of this word to mean two things. I thought to carry with me the lack of freedom and the desire for freedom, even though I had been freed. And why would one want to do that? Well, because freedom always has to be renewed. America is constantly in progress, in process, in the constant renewal of freedom. And then the other thing I want to point out, so of course we have this idea of this man reaching 33, which is a biblically resonant year, and this was something that often came up in a 19th century abolitionist literature, is the sort of black Christ figure. Slavery is this sort of crucifixion-like scourge of African Americans. So maybe there's something with the numerology there, but also this idea of inscribed upon my back, which refers to the scars of slavery, but also, as I was saying before, the idea of history as something written on the body and written through the body. I now use ink to keep record, and yet inscription also isn't just a matter of what you inscribe with ink on paper, but what is inscribed on and by the body. And so I think that these are all of these themes in the poem are brought up in the whole poem are brought up in this first sonnet in the sequence. And I just want to point out a few other things. First of all is the way that this poem represents the native guard as keeping watch over the white Confederate soldiers, and some of the ironies of that process. And one of the ironies is that one of the sonnets we're reading is written in a journal that was kept by a white person in the South, a Confederate that they had taken, that the black soldier took from his home. So we take these things we need from the Confederates' abandoned homes: salt, sugar, even this journal, near full with someone else's words, overlapped now, cross-hatched beneath mine, on every page his story intersecting with my own. So I think what's being said there is fairly clear, that American history is this interweaving of the stories of black and white, of North and South, and you can't tell any one of those stories alone. All of these stories have to be told together. Those stories intersect, so you can't be exclusionary in your approach to American history, to the American canon. And then another irony treated in the sequence is this sort of grim irony, which is that if you've read Frederick Douglass's narrative, which I'm sure many of you have, you'll know that one of the key ideas of the American slave narrative was the idea of the way that the white slave owners withheld literacy from the enslaved, because they believed that literacy would be a tool of their liberation. And Frederick Douglass talks about his struggle to attain literacy. And ironically, the soldiers in the Native Guard, the African-American soldiers, are more literate than many of the white Confederate soldiers they're keeping, who are presumably like farmers who have been drafted into this war, and so aren't themselves necessarily slave owners or sort of ideologues of racism in the way that the governing class of the South would have been. And so we have a moment here in the March 1863 sonnet where the African-American soldiers are writing letters home for the soldiers, the white soldiers who are illiterate. I listen, put down in ink what I know they labor to say between silences, too big for words. Worry for beloveds. My dearest, how are you getting along? What has become of their small plots of land? Did you harvest enough food to put by? They long for the comfort of former lives. I see you as you were, waving goodbye. Some send photographs, a likeness in case the body can't return. Others dictate harsh facts of this war. The hot air carries the stench of limbs rotten in the bone pit. Flies swarm, a black cloud. We hunger, grow weak. When men die, we eat their share of hardtack. So just a couple things I want to point out formally. So if you look at the footnotes, which I didn't put pictures of here, often Trethewey is directly quoting from historical documents. So she's directly bringing the past into the present. And then the other thing I'd point out is I describe this as free verse, and it is, even though it has 14 lines as of a sonnet. And yet there are these sort of slant rhymes or off rhymes or interior rhymes that Trethewey sometimes uses. So we have case, dictate, weak, hardtack, by, lives, by, goodbye. So it's not a full formal sonnet, because I don't think she wants to fully use that tradition. I think she thinks that that's probably a little bit obsolete in some of the same way that Louise Glick, when we were reading her poetry, thought that those kinds of strict forms had basically become obsolete. And yet there's these echoes of them. There's this minimal remainder of them in these slant rhymes. So it's still reads as poetry. It's not just prose arbitrarily broken up into lines, but it has the shadow of form if it doesn't have full form. So that's one thing. And then another thing I want to point out is that this, again, it reflects the idea of intersecting narratives and shared experience, that the hot air carries the stench of limbs rotten in the bone pit, flies swarm a black cloud. So just as George Saunders in this moment also harked back to the Civil War as this moment of American violence that resonates down through the centuries, that has emancipatory elements, the end of American slavery, the renewal, as I think Ta-Nehisi Coates would see it, of the promise of American freedom. Nevertheless, it's also this history of trauma and violence for everyone resonating into the present. The violence kind of continues on, inscribed in the body, as I think Saunders and Coates and Trethewey would all agree. And this is why they call upon this memory, this historical memory of the Civil War. So that's Natasha Trethewey's Native Guard. I want to turn now to something that seems like a very different piece of writing that's just worlds away from Native Guard. It's something that wasn't in the anthology, though I have to imagine it will be in the anthology in its further editions, because it's just something people teach all the time, because it's sort of easy to teach for reasons both good and bad. Which is the short story Black Box by Jennifer Egan, which I made available to you as a PDF on the course site. So Native Guard was from 2006, Black Box is from 2012, and I think Black Box is very much a story in line with the new sincerity. There's something, it's Egan and Saunders are writers, I think, that have a lot in common, a lot of interests in common. I'm sure they know each other. And yet there's also something of the new authenticity about it. And then there's also aspects of it that introduce a technological element I think we haven't really seen before. So who is Jennifer Egan? She was born in 1962 in Chicago and raised in San Francisco, which I think is important, because this is a story coming out of the kind of Silicon Valley ethos of the 21st century. And she also briefly dated Steve Jobs, and I only mention that because it's, I don't usually tell you who our authors briefly dated, but I think that also is kind of relevant for the reason I was just saying, that this story reflects technological changes, media changes that are important for the 21st century. She wrote journalism as well as fiction starting in the 1980s and is most famous for her novel A Visit from the Goon Squad from 2010, which is a novel sort of in short stories. So it's a series of short stories that add up to the novel with science fictional elements, so it ends in the future. And it's about popular music, sort of all the characters kind of circle around the world of pop music and technology and time, and famously one of the chapters is told in the form of PowerPoint slides. So if you pick up the book, one of the chapters is a slideshow that advances the plot and develops the characters, but is nevertheless a slideshow. And Black Box is a sequel to A Visit from the Goon Squad. If you read it, you'll remember there are these mentions of the narrator's mother and father and their and her relationship with them, which go back to, and her husband who is from Kenya. All of that goes back to characters who are in a visit from the Goon Squad. But I think it's a story that nevertheless stands on its own, that you don't have to read A Visit from the Goon Squad to appreciate. And then the key thing about this story is that it was first published on Twitter. So it was first published as a series of tweets. And you might have noticed as you were reading it that each paragraph is exactly, within the original character limit of Twitter, which was 140 characters. And so it's trying to not just reflect media changes, which I think we've seen writers throughout the semester try to do. I think I mentioned the way in which cinema was an influence on the fiction writers of the mid-20th century. Particularly, I think Flannery O'Connor we could look at as a writer who was very cinematic. She mostly gave you visual descriptions and actions and dialogue, the kind of thing that would appear on screen. That's just one example. Another example is we saw Don DeLillo pretty recently in the class, who I think was deliberately, it wasn't as obvious in the excerpt I gave you as it is in other moments in the novel, but White Noise was a novel highly influenced by television, and we saw that epiphanic moment where the main character's daughter repeats a line from a commercial. So we've seen this influence of other media on literature, and now we see the influence of social media and digital media here in the very literal form of the story appearing first appearing on and as social media. So the New Yorker magazine, which publishes a lot of short fiction, probably originally published a lot of the fiction we've read throughout the semester, publishes this story initially from its Twitter account, and each of the paragraphs you read was originally a tweet. So we want to think about that in the way in which media is changing literature. And I think that that's evident as well in the last story we're going to talk about by Charles Yu, which is structured according to what the characters are searching for, what they're Googling. So we have this, because you have to understand that one of the things here is that television and movies were sort of rivalrous to literature because they had something that literature didn't. They were largely visual. They were moving images. And so literary writers, I think, felt this anxiety about, were they as fun and as cool as these moving visual images? Social media brings in another complication, because while a lot of that can be visual and video oriented, and, there's Instagram and YouTube and whatnot, a lot of social media is just language, is just a post of words, whether that be in the early 2000s with blogging and then moving into things like tweets and posts on various websites. So I think that literature possibly can engage in a less anxious way with social media, because a lot of social media shares the medium of literature, which is words. Whereas the previous rival media of the early and late 20th century, film and television, seemed more alien because they were involved in images. So let's just remember some of the changes we've seen with the rise of social media over the last 25 years or so. So we move from a world of movies, and movies are not interactive. You go to the theater originally and you sit and you watch the movie. And then television is introduced in the 1950s. So movies, by the way, are introduced in the early 20th century and they become ubiquitous in the 1920s. Then in the 1950s, you have television, and television moves visual media, audiovisual media into the home. And so it's almost like watching a movie in your home, and it's more participatory. You can change the channel. Originally, there's only 3 channels, and then you have the introduction of cable television in the 1980s, which drastically broadens the amount of TV you can watch. You can flip through hundreds of channels and make your choice, though there's still something passive about it. The media comes to you. You can choose what you want to watch, but that's you don't actually change the content. You don't produce the content. You don't interact with the content. The internet, which begins, as Thomas Pynchon would be happy to tell us, with the defense industry. It's basically a creation of military technology in the 60s, and then becomes available to consumers in the 1990s. What the internet makes available is a form of media that you create. You don't just, it's not just like the television, you choose which media you want to interact with, but you become the co-creator of the content. And this particularly pertains to Web 2.0, the second generation of the internet, which really becomes prominent in the early 2000s. So the first version of the internet, you could create a static web page and you could maybe post to message boards. And by the way, to create a static web page, you had to know HTML and other programming languages and things like that. So it wasn't something that just anybody could do. You had to have some prior interest in technology to participate. Starting in the early 2000s, you start getting platforms that make it a lot easier for anyone to participate in the creation of content, the response to content. So you move static HTML pages to a more interactive and dynamic web experience, as I quote from a website called Technopedia, defining this idea of Web 2.0. And I just put on the side of this slide a timeline. So you have in 1997 the rise of AOL Instant Messenger. Well, you're probably too young for that, but that was a way you would sort of, it was like a kind of a messaging system. That is the way that we all kept in touch back in high school and college in the late 90s and early 2000s. You have LiveJournal in 1999, which is one of the first popular blogging platforms. You have MySpace introduced in 2003, and then Facebook in 2004, which became, these were places where you'd post your profile and then interact with your quote-unquote friends. You have YouTube introduced in 2005, which becomes the first place where you can easily upload and share video content like I'm doing now. You have Twitter introduced in 2006, which becomes this micro-blogging social media platform. You have the iPhone introduced in 2007, which isn't a platform, but rather an actual technological device through which you can mobily access these platforms. So you aren't just confined to sitting with your computer. You can now do this from anywhere that you happen to be with your mobile device. And then you have Instagram introduced in 2010, which adds a further realm of the pictorial. And then you've had all sorts of things since then, TikTok and Snapchat and what have you, things I'm too old for. But that my point is, you have this increasing rise of the social media, which then becomes portable social media you take with you everywhere. And we see the development of what we were looking at in the 80s with the gradual kind of encroachment of technological communications onto the person. And the next frontier, I'm sure, it will be wearable devices or implanted devices or things like this, which is precisely, by the way, what this story Black Box posits. The other thing I would just point out is that Web 2.0, there were kind of two phases of responses to it. There was an incredibly utopian phase, which I would position around from like the late 2000s to the early 2010s. Things like the Arab Spring are key moments here, where it was said that social media would allow humanity to come together and sort of democratically overthrow all, as part of that end of history idea, that through social media, we will come together and create more and more democracy and overthrow any kind of undemocratic regime and just get rid of anything that constrains humanity. And the Arab Spring, in which a series of Middle Eastern nations had revolutions, not all of them successful, that were powered by social media, was a key moment in this idea of social media as human liberation, social media as further extension of the end of history and the spread of liberal democracy. Then, starting in the middle of the last decade, you have a much more dystopian view, that social media becomes a vector of illiberal, anti-democratic forces, that it becomes a platform for misinformation and for hate and for a kind of verbal violence and harassment, and thus it becomes necessary. So in the earlier phase, the tech monopolies that control these platforms were hailed for not being censors, that we can let everyone have their say and this will extend democracy. And now it's demanded that they crack down on hate and misinformation and harassment and constrain what can be said, because free speech doesn't lead, we now believe, to this end of history extension of democracy, but it leads in fact to the recrudescence, the reemergence of evil forms of illiberal government we thought we had left behind. So to properly maintain the end of history, if we don't want history as ideological conflict to start up again, we must now constrain the speech on these platforms. So there's been this utopian moment and this dystopian moment about what social media meant and means for us, and who knows what will come next. Black Box from 2012 belongs to this utopian moment. It's clearly a text of the optimism, the forward-looking technological utopianism of the early Obama administration and its version of the end of history. And so we see that. So what is going on with this story? So first of all, the first thing to note is, again, it's tweeted. So everything in it is very concise and within this character limit. The second thing to note about it is that it's science fiction. It's set in some version of the future. It's also a spy story. I think that reflects something important, which we also saw with George Saunders, which is this collapse of the distinction that we first observed in the 1960s with Philip K. Dick and Ursula K. Le Guin, this distinction between literary fiction and genre fiction. This now no longer holds at all. You can publish literary fiction that has science fiction elements, detective fiction elements, spy story elements, etc. There's really, this boundary has just been wholly effaced, I would say, right now. There's no longer that mid-20th century idea that really goes back to the late 19th century, that realism is the gold standard for fiction. That doesn't exist anymore. So you can write genre fiction, you can write science fiction, spy fiction, the way that Saunders and Egan do, and the way that Junot Diaz has done, though not in the work we read, and you won't find yourself in any way stigmatized. So that's the second thing to note about it. It has this genre element that does not in any way compromise its literary distinction in the eyes of the cognoscenti, those who know, those who presume to know what literature is, though I suppose I'm one of them if I'm teaching this class. So there's that. And then another thing to note about this formally is that it's written in a very unusual way. It's written in the second person. So instead of so we talked about how stories can be written in the first person and the third person, and mostly that's what stories are. This is written in the second person. We are being addressed by the narrator, and we almost become the main character. Now, why does this narrator address us? Well, because she is a spy, a kind of technologically enhanced spy who's been recruited by the U.S. government to infiltrate some kind of terrorist gang or criminal cartel. And there's apparently this new way that the government, instead of having people who are career intelligence agents, instead of doing that, they recruit agents from normal walks of life to serve sort of one mission and then be done, because this allows them to be more effective infiltrators if they aren't known to be sort of have careers in espionage. And one of the ways that this recruitment works is you are given your instructions by your precursor. So we have been recruited into the role. We are this, we as the audience are participating in this government service, and we are being told by this woman who was a spy before us what to do. You will be infiltrating the lives of criminals. You will be in constant danger. Some of you will not survive, but those who do will be heroes. A few of you will save lives and even change the course of history. We ask of you an impossible combination of traits, ironclad scruples, and a willingness to violate them. We'll come back to that. An abiding love for your country and a willingness to consort with individuals who are working actively to destroy it. The instincts and intuitions of experts and the blank records and true freshness of ingenues, etc. So this second person address, I think, makes this story particularly didactic, which is to say it gives us a moral lesson. Now, obviously, she's trying to give us a lesson in espionage, which is one thing, but also she keeps giving us, our narrator keeps giving us these sort of pep talks, these sort of moral instructions on how we should behave. You will reflect on the fact that too much reflection is pointless. You will reflect on the fact that these instructions are becoming less and less instructive. Your field instructions stored in a chip beneath your hairline will serve as both a mission log and a guide for others undertaking this work, etc. But I want to look at you will reflect on the fact that too much reflection is pointless. This to me is very much in that vein of the new sincerity, the way that David Foster Wallace was trying to use reflections on subjectivity and morality to lead ultimately not into the endless labyrinth of self-questioning that postmodernism lures us into, but to break us out of it by having us not actually reflect so much, but come to some solid ground of moral action. Don't eat lobsters, they feel pain, in Wallace's work, or the way the narrator in Civil War Land and Bad Decline by Saunders came to the realization, at the time of his death, that he should have morally acted to prevent the corruptions in his life earlier. This too, too much reflection is pointless. Just morally act. Always filter your observations and experience through the lens of their didactic value. So postmodernism makes didacticism difficult because it's such an open field of possibilities, as we saw in Paley's and Le Guin's work. That's about the only didactic thing it tells us. But within that, you can't really tell people what to do morally because there are, so few strict guidelines we can have. Well, this stories, being a participant in the idea of the new sincerity, I think says that, well, you can be didactic. You can hand down the moral law. One of the things this story hands down the moral law about, I think in keeping with what we were seeing in Trethewey's work, is about race, gender, and class. This emphasis on identity politics that has marked so much of the literature, particularly of the last 10 years, though it was an outgrowth of the concerns we already saw of the multicultural movement that went back, to the 70s and to the liberation movements of the 60s. So this story, first of all, tries to decenter whiteness. So our protagonist, our narrator, is a white woman, but she's married to a man from Kenya. And she says, if you love someone with dark skin, white skin looks drained of something vital. So this de-promotion of the white ideal as a beauty standard, as a standard of anything. This decentering of whiteness is something this story tries to accomplish, as well as the decentering of ways of life associated with dominant white culture. You will reflect on the fact that your husband, coming from a culture of tribal allegiance, understands and applauds your patriotism. You will reflect on the fact that America is your husband's chosen country and that he loves it. You will reflect on the fact that your husband's rise to prominence would have been unimaginable in any other nation. So there's an interesting double gesture happening here. Whiteness is being decentered to make America seem all the more great, to make America seem all the more exceptional, because America is a country that at the end of history is the true bearer of multicultural values and multiracial and anti-racist values. So patriotism, loving America, and demoting and decentering whiteness become key ideas that are related, which wouldn't have been, I think, the gesture you saw in an Ishmael Reed or a Gloria Anzaldúa, who I think wanted to lodge charges against the historical the historical role America has played in the world against America's founding structures, which I think in many ways they would have seen as complicit with the injustices they were decrying. For Egan, you can make anti-racism Americanism. You can make anti-racism sort of in the way, I'm not making any accusations here, but in the way that the CIA intervened in culture in the 1950s to turn what looked like dissident movements, like modernism and abstractionism and painting and jazz music, etc., into weapons against communism. So we see these anti-racist multicultural ideas being reappropriated as elements that give America superior standing in the world and make America, add to this idea of American exceptionalism. And the thing is, I don't have to make an accusation. I don't think the CIA sponsored this story. In the story, the character is proudly working on behalf of a secret agency of the U.S. government and promoting anti-racism, and as you'll see in a moment, feminism and other such goals. So this idea that social justice, multiculturalism, and American exceptionalism, American, what an older tradition would have more skeptically called American imperialism, that these things can go together is, I think, key to this story, that America can be redeemed. So we see that in terms of race. We also see it, I think, in terms of gender. This is a story that's very much about gendered violence. We have a female protagonist and a female narrator who is infiltrating this cartel or whatever it is. We're not, I don't say whatever it is because I wasn't paying attention. It's just kept very vague in the story because it's not really the point of the story. She's infiltrating this male-dominated organization, and in order to do it, she has to pose as one of the women that the men who lead this organization sort of keep around as sexual objects, whom they treat as sexual objects, what she calls these beauties. And she says no beauty is really a beauty, because beauty is this position into which these women have been placed by this patriarchal criminal gang that this woman has infiltrated. And so she reflects that she has to sort of make herself available for this sexual abuse in order to infiltrate the gang. And in so doing, she points out again the way that that feminism can be a part of this American goodness in the world, because these men that she's infiltrating are this patriarchal, sexually abusive, sexual assaulters, and she is infiltrating and warring against them. Now, race and gender are one thing. I think they're much more easily discussed in these terms, that America can be a feminist nation, an anti-racist nation on behalf of whom our narrator can be a hero. On the other hand, class is a little bit more complicated. She's obviously been recruited from the educated professional upper middle classes. They are the sort of ones who can sort of most easily do this work, it's implied. So we're not looking at an America that will be economically equitable. That's not necessarily a priority of this story's vision. But she does suggest that this criminal gang that she's infiltrating is awash in dirty money and corrupt money. So your job is to follow money to its source. So presumably whatever economic inequalities exist in America are the product of meritocratic achievement, the way in which her husband was able to rise to prominence because America is a country that is able to get past racist ideas. And so if gender and race don't structure and don't prevent people from rising through the ranks, then the ideal of meritocracy is left standing. Whereas America's enemies in this story, especially its non-state enemies, whether that be terrorist organizations or criminal gangs, they are wealthy and enjoying a life of luxury due to corruption. So that's how this story solves the problem of class, I would argue. I want to say a few more things about this story's ideas about gender, though. So one of the things we note is that this story is science fictional. It's set in the future, and our heroine is essentially a cyborg, a person who combines human and machine elements. So we read, she tells us, because we are being recruited into this heroic drive, a microphone has been implanted just beyond the first turn of your right ear canal. A button is embedded behind the inside ligament of your right knee if right-handed. The camera implanted in your left eye is operated by pressing your left tear duct. Reach between your right fourth and pinky toes if right-handed, and remove the data plug from your universal port. So why are we given all these details? What is the importance of these details, and why is it necessary that this heroine be a cyborg and not just someone who's carrying this equipment somewhere on her person? Well, I think it relates to this idea of cyborg feminism. So there was a literary and cultural theorist named Donna Haraway who writes an essay called A Cyborg Manifesto in 1984, in which she argues that previous forms of feminism were too rooted in this idea of essentialism, that a woman was this and a man was that. And moreover, she saw them as being tied to this idea that matriarchal traditions, cultures ruled by women, once governed the world and then were overthrown by patriarchal cults, which had masculine gods. And there was this interest she saw in recovering goddess imagery. And we saw that in, I think, in Gloria Anseldua's work, in Louise Erdrich's work, this interest in mythology and this interest in forms of female power that can derive from mythological traditions. And Haraway said that that's not really a fit way to think in the technological postmodern world. The way to think about it is that technology enables us to get away from essentialist ideas about gender because it allows us to transform our bodies in ways that aren't tied down to quote unquote natural ideas about gender. And so she ends the essay with her famous statement, which is, I just sampled it from a quote meme site: "I'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess." So we have this cyborg heroine, and yet nevertheless I think that doesn't interfere with the authenticity of the story. I think this is a story of the new sincerity, but it's also a story of the new authenticity, because Egan, like Trethewey, is concerned with the way that her speaker, her narrator, gains authority by telling us about her embodied experience. And just as Trethewey's speaker tells us about their embodied experiences as Black men who have survived slavery, so the speaker, the narrator of Black Box, tells us about her experience as an embodied subject, as a woman, but nonetheless a woman who is empowered and enhanced by technology. So if one view of the late 20th and early 21st century was kind of dystopian about our technological life, in Don DeLillo, for instance, or in the theories of Jean Baudrillard, who say that it just creates a world of simulacra that imprisons us in falsity, and in DeLillo's work, it alienates us from ourselves so that we don't even have authentic experiences of our bodies. For Egan, technology can be a much more emancipatory, liberatory force. It empowers, in this case, a female narrator to become a hero through the way that it enhances her. And I think in this we see an idea of feminism that moves away from essentialism, that moves away from attaching gender to nature and frees gender from nature. And implicit in this are things like theories of gender fluidity, gender queerness, transgenderism, that just completely detach the idea of gender from the idea of nature. And I think that's also very much a part of the identity politics of our time. And yet you can still have an authentic experience of being this embodied subject. Another thing that happens in this story is that the narrator theorizes what she calls the new heroism. And this is pretty much where I want to end. She gives a long, almost sermon-like series of tweets, which, by the way, is another form of emancipatory technology in the story. Tweeting, social media, becomes the means to convey all of the liberatory ideologies we've just been discussing. And one of the things she conveys is this theory of the new heroism. You are one of hundreds, each a potential hero. Technology has afforded ordinary people a chance to glow in the cosmos of human achievement. Your lack of espionage and language training is what makes your record clean and neutral. You are an ordinary person undertaking an extraordinary task. You need not be remarkable for your credentials or skill sets, only for your bravery and equilibrium. Knowing that you are one of hundreds shouldn't feel belittling. In the new heroism, the goal is to merge with something larger than yourself. In the new heroism, the goal is to throw off generations of self-involvement. In the new heroism, the goal is to renounce the American fixation with being seen and recognized. In the new heroism, the goal is to dig beneath your shiny persona. You'll be surprised by what lies under it, a rich, deep crawl space of possibilities. Some liken this discovery to a dream in which a familiar home acquires new wings and rooms. The power of individual magnetism is nothing against the power of combined selfless effort. You may accomplish astonishing personal feats, but citizen agents rarely seek individual credit. They liken the need for personal glory to cigarette addiction, a habit that feels life-sustaining even as it kills you. Childish attention-seeking is usually satisfied at the expense of real power. An enemy of the state could not have connived a better way to declaw and distract us. So the new heroism is a form of collective effort in which we come together anonymously to undo the damage done by injustice. And we must refuse the individualism that postmodernism locks us into by imprisoning us within the languages and signs that don't allow us to touch reality. And in this, I think, Egan is trying to use social media to work against some of the logic of social media. I think the utopian idea of social media is that it would enable us to come together for a collective effort, whereas I think in reality it probably leads more to individual self-assertion. We all become these selves asserting our power. And so I think that that is one of the questions this story leaves us with. Does this technology lead to this sincere and indeed authentic assertion of collective emancipatory power, as it did when it led to protests like the Arab Spring, or, by the way, like some of the early Black Lives Matter protests in 2014 and 2015, which were also empowered by social media, or like the Occupy Wall Street protests of 2011, which I think played a similar role? Does it allow us to come together selflessly, or does it lead to this assertion of self, in which case it would be more on the postmodern side? It's just this free-floating individualism, as we saw in Ursula K. Le Guin or Grace Paley. So does the social media revolution lead to this new heroism, or does it not? In the end, though, this new heroism, this struggle for a collective rather than an individual identity, is, I also think, a key to the culture of the last 10 years. And we see it in those protest movements. We see it in the new sincerity, which, the idea of the new sincerity is to get the reader to do something, get the reader to join you. You as the author and you as the reader come together. Stop eating lobsters. Stop obsessing with yourself. Join up with the U.S. government and right the wrongs of the world, and or go out in a crowd and protest and come together that way, as Charles Yu implies in Systems. But in any case, new heroism is collective heroism. The old heroism was very individualist. The tragic heroism of Ellen West, of Troy Maxson, of Blanche Dubois. It couldn't really be effective, but it sure was glorious. Now we have this new heroism come together to get things done on behalf of this authentic, inscribed in the body desire for human freedom. And then the last thing I'll say is some people have been a little bit skeptical of the new heroism and the new sincerity. So, for instance, there's a moment in the story where Egan's narrator worries that she's going to have to shoot a woman holding a baby. And she says, when self-preservation requires that you harm the innocent, we can provide no more than guidelines. As Americans, we value human rights above all and cannot sanction their violation. When someone threatens our human rights, however, a wider leeway becomes necessary. Follow your instincts while bearing in mind that we must and will hew to our principles. So that's a non-answer, and that leads us into the paradox of, to defend human rights, you might have to go to war. To go to war will involve you, probably, reality being what it is, in violating human rights. And Egan is writing this in 2012, which is less than a decade after the Abu Ghraib torture scandal, in which some intelligence agents in Iraq during the Iraq War were exposed through photographic evidence of having tortured the prisoners under their command. And so I think Egan must be thinking, when she introduces this qualm, that we value human rights, and so when anyone is a danger to our human rights, we might have to violate theirs, this terrible paradox. Does this in some way compromise the new heroism? Does this in some ways lead to a lack of the critical intellect that postmodernism emphasized above all? And I excerpted a bit from an essay called They Could Be Heroes, written by Sam Sachs in the New Republic in 2017. It was a review of a series of novels by, I think George Saunders was one of the authors. I don't think Egan was one. I think it was Saunders and a couple of others, and all writers who I think represent the new sincerity. And Sam Sachs was a little bit skeptical, and he thought that there was something basically naive and childish in this largely Generation X cohort of writers who seem to harbor these ideas about the possibilities of heroism and moral sincerity and moral clarity that I think he thinks are naive compared to the writers of the previous generation. So he says, the essential difference is that these writers, the writers of the new sincerity, lack Pynchon's conspiratorial worldview. That would be Thomas Pynchon, and remember the paranoia we saw in his work. The Cold War, Vietnam, Watergate, and the recessions of the 1970s and 1980s fertilized the fiction of professional paranoiacs like Pynchon and Don DeLillo, and of the so-called dirty realists like Raymond Carver. These writers spoofed or subverted the country's origin myths. Having come of age during the peace and prosperity of the 1990s, today's novelists enlarge those myths, produce ideas of America as a place that could be essentially good, whereas the writers of the previous postmodern generations subverted that idea. And I think that Sachs is pointing to that idea of the end of history, that we've arrived at the end of history. There's no more ideological conflict, and fiction just becomes a series of reflections on how America's essential goodness can be renewed despite the calamities it's committed in its past, how we can get past that and create that more perfect union spoken of in the founding documents, and extend human rights and extend freedom. And is this not childish? Is this not, from the point of view of a Pynchon or a DeLillo or even a Carver, is this not dangerously naive? And I just did a little search of the story, and the word child and recollections of childhood occurred 20 times in this relatively brief text, as if the story were trying to suffuse its own dangerous atmosphere of espionage with the nostalgic glow of childhood. And so I don't know. We all have to come to our own decisions on what we think about the new sincerity, the new heroism, these ideals that the writers of the younger generation of the last 10 and 20 years are promoting, as opposed to the more skeptical, corrosive, and critical views of the postmodern generations. So that's Jennifer Egan, that's Black Box, and that's the end of this lecture. Thanks very much and have a great day.